Hello, everyone. Welcome to Relevant Series 2022. My name is Hilda, and I will be your MC for this evening. And we're so glad that you've joined us for the talk this evening. The topic of the talk tonight is an argument for God's existence from machines. And me personally, as an engineer, I'm very intrigued by this title. I get to see in my daily life how much we've become more and more reliant on machines and technology. And so it's going to be really interesting to hear what our speaker has to share on this topic. Just to give you a brief idea of what Relevant Series is, it's a series of talks and social events that we have going on over the next 3 days. And we want to engage questions about life and faith and culture and other topics. And so the format, the way that tonight's going to work is we're going to have 20 minutes of a talk, and then we'll have 40 minutes of Q&A afterwards. So we really want to be interacting with you and hearing what your questions are and being able to answer them. And so before we get into the talk, I want to do a land acknowledgement. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the land I am on as I moderate this talk. I acknowledge that this is the traditional territory of multiple nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I acknowledge that I am a settler, and I thank the First Peoples who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. And I'm grateful that I have the privilege of being able to live and work on these lands. And I acknowledge that I have a lot to learn and unlearn about the history of these lands. And I know that there's a lot of work left to be done to repent of wrongs from the past and present and move towards reconciliation with First Peoples. So I will transition to explain how we're going to do the Q&A portion of the evening. So we'll use a platform called Slido, and you can go to slido.com and then type in the code, which is relevant 2022. So make sure you enter in relevant 2022. It's updated from what we had on the screen previously. You'll be able to type in your questions there, as well as upvote other questions to make sure they get prioritized. And just some ground rules for the Q&A time. We ask that you don't be afraid to ask challenging questions and to challenge ideas, but please refrain from any personal attacks, and please refrain from using any inappropriate language. And also try your best to make your questions personal and use I rather than generalizing and using we. I think that'll help you to get the most out of the Q&A time. So now let's get to the talk. I am privileged to introduce our speaker tonight. His name is Andy Steiger. He is a pastor and also completed his PhD in theological anthropology at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Andy seeks to provide a more robust understanding of what a person is from a Christian perspective, and has written multiple books and created video series on this topic. One of which is The Human Project, which was a video series which debuted at film festivals around the world and won a number of awards, including Best Short Film and People's Choice. Andy is originally from Portland, Oregon, and currently lives in Abbotsford, British Columbia with his wife, Nancy, and their boys. So I will now pass it over to Andy for tonight's talk.
Thank you so much. It is great to be with you this evening. I'm here in Abbotsford, British Columbia. And yes, it was a beautiful day today. I hear it's very snowy out there in Toronto. Hope that you guys have dug yourselves out and are doing well. Tonight, we're going to be talking on this subject of machines, and I'm going to be giving an argument for the existence of God from machines. And I feel that before we jump into things, I just need to make a couple things clear. First, this is not a formal presentation. This is more of a conversation. So as I talk, I'm more bringing up ideas that I've been thinking through and arguments that I've been developing. And I should also acknowledge that these arguments that I'm going to share with you, I began developing in my doctoral work. In particular, I studied a scientist turned philosopher by the name of Michael Polanyi. And these, so I have to just acknowledge that I was inspired by his thoughts, and that I then developed these ideas from there. And that kind of gives a little bit of background as to where I'm coming at from this. As well, I think it's important to realize that I by no means believe that tonight, if you're an atheist or if you're on the fence about God's existence, that I am going to give you the evidence that's going to prove it without a shadow of a doubt, and everybody's going to leave this conversation believing that God exists because of machines. I am much more realistic than that, and I realize that faith is something in which we place our trust in what we have good reason to believe is true. And so people are weighing the evidence and they're making decisions. And so as we talk, I really just see this as evidence that you can put on your scales of faith as you're thinking through how do you understand the world that you and I live in, and what is a correct way of understanding who we are and the world that we live in, and whether or not God is a part of that world or not. And I think it's important too, as we jump into this question, to realize one of the foundations of what I'll be doing is really give you an argument from purpose. Now, depending upon how you come to this argument, you may have already have anticipated that I'm going to talk about William Paley or something like that and give like a watchmaker type argument. I'm not going to do that. Interestingly as well, I'm not really going to give so much of a propositional logic argument as I'm going to be giving more of a modal logic argument as well, which is a little bit more of a unique argument. And as we get into that, I'll explain that nuance a little bit more. Before we do, though, I think it's important to note, as was said, I know that some of you are coming to this conversation from a background, say, in engineering. And so I just want to I want to frame the conversation a little bit for you scientists to appreciate the distinctions that we're going to be getting after. In what we would call pure science, in which you would have, often you hear physics being referred to as the queen of the sciences, the idea being that in pure science, the goal is to reduce things to their particulars, the parts that they're made up of, and to study the laws that they follow. Whereas an engineer falls within what's called applied science, in which they are taking those parts that the universe is made up of and the laws that they follow, but they can take those parts and arrange them into purposeful machines, for example, to achieve various functions. And so this is one of the very first arguments or ideas that I want to kind of lay down as a foundation. And that is, particularly from the Christian perspective, that there is a difference between the parts that a thing is made of and the purposeful whole that a thing is made for. Let me say that again. There is a difference between the parts that a thing is made of and the purposeful whole that a thing is made for. And so the argument that I'll be getting after is very much along the lines of what is the purpose of a machine, and what does that teach us about ourselves? But then when we think more about that, what does that teach us about God, and particularly, does God exist? So I'm going to jump right into things. And to do that, I'm going to be sharing my screen. And I have a presentation here that I'm going to be sharing with you. I'm assuming that this is all working correctly. And if it's not, please somebody stop me. So again, an argument for God from machines. As I jump into this, I've written this out because it kind of gets a little bit complicated, and I want you to be able to follow with me, and then it'll help you to be able to ask questions at the end. So let's jump into things. I'm going to be giving you two arguments for God from machines, and this is the first argument. Now, normally in propositional logic, arrows like this would mean if-then statements. So if mind, then machines, if machines, then purpose. But that's not what I'm presenting here. These arrows are just showing you a linear progression of how things are made. So that minds create machines and machines have purposes is the idea. And this, I need to just mention again, this is a very Polanyian concept. A fun fact, Polanyi's son actually teaches at, or taught at the University of Toronto. I believe that he is still alive. Now, one of the things that's happening there with the arrow that's unique, and maybe I can show this just with this Lego from my son. I have two kids. I have a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old, so I snagged some of their Lego tonight. But what we have here is a mind created this machine, and this machine represents a purpose. And this can be talked about, particularly when you in the area of study in philosophy with regards to meaning or purpose, as a from-to relationship. And the idea that a from-to relationship is that you're talking from its parts to its purpose. What is this machine? What is its purpose? What is this machine's function? And so, of course, we understand what a helicopter's function is, to fly, and can be used for then various purposes. So with that layer in place, I want to take this one step further. As I mentioned, I'm making more of a modal logic argument. And modal logic is distinct from propositional logic in that modal logic is an argument from necessity. It's saying that something is just necessarily so. And it's a different way of thinking. And let me just kind of help you to see how this works. Now, I showed you the symbolic logic of how this works, and that italics square represents necessity. And so what we're saying then is if B, then necessarily A. So here I've just written this out propositionally then. So purpose is the from to intention or intentions of a mind. Like a helicopter, it's a mind that is creating these purposes. Number two, all machines exist to serve a purpose or purposes. Now, I think that that's one of the defining facts of a machine. A machine is something that serves a purpose. Now, notice though, I'm defining machines in this way very loosely, and so loosely, in fact, that you could actually say that language is a machine of sorts. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a mechanical machine like a helicopter, for example. It could actually be language could serve in that language and sound waves are being used for purposes to communicate. Lastly, therefore, if a machine exists, a mind is ultimately responsible. So now this is the modal logic part that can be seen, where we're saying if there's a machine, so like for B there, we could put machine there. So we could say if machine, then a mind. Now, I think that this gets interesting to begin to tease out, and I'll come at this from a couple different perspectives, but I kind of wrote this out just to help you to start to like get your mind around what I'm talking about here. And here's one way of putting that. A mind can exist without a machine existing. So you can have a person, right, that doesn't create a machine, but you can't, but a machine cannot exist without a mind existing first. So a machine is the product of purposes, and purpose is the product of mind. So if you have a machine, then you necessarily have a mind. And as well, you could talk about how if you have a machine, then you also have purpose, that those are working in tandem. So now we can develop this argument a little bit further. So machines are composite structures that serve one or more purposes. Machines cannot be the cause of their own composite structure. Therefore, a prior, and this is key here, a prior ordering principle must exist, which has the requisite control of artificially shaping machines. Now, I'm using the word artificial here in place of natural shaping. So by natural shaping, going back to what I said at the very beginning, that there's a difference between the parts that a thing is made of and the purposeful whole that a thing is made for. So when we're talking about the parts that a thing is made of, they follow natural shaping, or we would say natural laws. So when I'm talking about artificial shaping, I'm talking about that engineering of a machine. And so what ultimately is being proposed here, the argument in essence is saying that if you have a machine, then you have these prior ordering principles that must exist with the ability to have shaped that machine. This then takes us one step further into this argument, where now we're going to come to God, where you could swap this now. Instead of mind, you could say divine mind, human machine, purpose. And so ultimately the argument works like this: humans exist. Humans are composite structures that serve one or more purposes. In other words, we can be viewed as a machine. Not in a dehumanizing way, of course, but in a way that we have different organs that have functions and operate in certain ways to sustain life. And therefore, a prior ordering principle must exist, which has the requisite control of artificially shaping humans. Now, I can already imagine some pushback on this, where you'd say, well, how we're human shaped, and some people might want to posit evolution or aspects or complexity theory or chaos theory or whatever theory that there might be, and we could talk more about that in Q&A. But the problem still is there, that you have these purposes that are found within the machinery, if you will, that need to be accounted for, and ultimately come back to this ordering principle that I would argue cannot be accounted for within natural shaping or natural laws. And I'm going to jump now into my second argument with the remainder time that I have, that will help to tease that out perhaps a little bit more and provide a unique way of viewing people. So artificially shaped composites are defined by their purpose. Humans are artificially shaped composites. Therefore, humans are defined by their purpose. So remember again what I said, there's a difference between the parts that a thing is made of and the purposeful whole that a thing is made for. So ultimately, I'm saying if that's the case, then humans should be defined according to their purpose and not their parts. Now, I talked about this in my previous talk this morning about human value. And one of this was actually during Q&A, and one of my critiques was, so often we hear in our culture that humans are just stardust. And in fact, there's a children's book called You Are Stardust that tells kids, listen, you're made of carbon, carbon's made from dying stars, and thus you are stardust. And the Christian worldview would say, no, you're made of stardust, but that doesn't define what you are. We intuitively never define a thing by its parts. We always define it by its whole. So much so that if I were to ask you, what is this? You wouldn't define it by its parts, like, oh, that's plastic. No, you'd say, well, it's a helicopter, or, oh, this, if I asked you what it was, you wouldn't go, oh, it's ceramic, right? Again, intuitively, we would say it's a cup. We define created things by their purpose, or we define composites by their purpose. Moving forward then, this is where things get unique and interesting, I think, when we start to think more deeply about this, is that there is a difference between static versus dynamic purpose. So on the one hand, what we have here is a car. On the one hand, we have a car that's operational, and you can see the other car has got its hood up and it is no longer operational. This can help us to appreciate the difference between static purpose and dynamic purpose. So static purpose is simply saying this, that if a car is not operational, how do I know what its purpose is? Well, I would need to have prior knowledge of its purpose. The problem is, though, is I could give you a whole litany of different machines that we have discovered in archaeology, or I could actually just show you a bunch from the 50s that you've never seen before, and you would not know its purpose. And if that machine's not in operation, and that's what I mean by static, it's not operating, then it's difficult to know what its purpose is. You would either have needed to have prior knowledge of its purpose, or you somehow need to get access to this dynamic purpose, which we'll get to in a moment. But for my purposes, and what I'm saying here is, it's important to appreciate that science can discover particulars and the laws they follow, but science is incapable of investigating a machine and determining what its purpose is. And by that I simply mean the purpose of a machine is not inherent to its parts. That is something that is being imposed over and above its parts and over and above the laws that those parts follow. Again, so that means that there is now this distinction between what I was talking about earlier with natural shaping versus artificial shaping. These are two different domains. We look at then dynamic purpose. Dynamic purpose is saying, well, if I see a car, for example, or a machine in operation, then I can deduce by watching it in operation what its purpose is. And so for a car, I can see that it moves people as an example. And by here, I just simply mean people can identify an active machine's purpose. So if I found a machine, for example, an archaeological machine, and you looked at it and I said, what is it? And you're like, well, I have no idea. But then all of a sudden you could get a glimpse into, you know, some Roman or Greek person using it. You would then immediately go, oh, okay, well, that's what its purpose is. You would begin to understand what it's used for. By the way, the same thing works with language. Language, you can learn dynamically by going and living in a culture and taking in the language, or you can learn it statically by using a textbook. But if you don't have access to prior knowledge and you don't have the dynamic, this is where we get dead languages from. Dead languages are simply static languages, and there is no way of accessing the purpose that those symbols represent, and thus it becomes dead. Now, I'm bringing all this up because you can apply the same ideas to a person. If a person has static purpose, and I think religion is really seeking to give an answer to what the purpose of human life is, that's one way that you could look at that. And so we could ask the question, okay, what is, for example, Christianity says the purpose of life? But there's another way to get after this question, and that is by looking at it dynamically. We can watch people in operation and say, okay, what happens when we watch people? What seems to be the purpose? Now, we can do this on both a micro and a macro level. So for example, you could look at the parts of a human being from cells, tissues, and organs like our heart and go, oh, it pumps blood. And then we can figure that out. Or you can actually look at the whole person and say, okay, what appears to be the purpose of human life? And what I would argue is that what we see is this hierarchy, which at the top you see a moral duty, a moral purpose that we could argue. And again, this isn't like some definitive argument. This is more inductive than it is deductive. And that is that by and large, people tend to define people at the highest level morally. And so that's ultimately what I'm getting at there. With the remaining time that I have, then this can be teased out into this kind of an argument. Purpose cannot be accounted for by physics. Humans are composed of purposes. A mind can account for purposes, therefore humans owe their existence to a mind. Again, this difference between natural shaping versus artificial shaping. If natural shaping can't account for composites, then you need to apply to artificial shaping. If humans can't account for themselves, you need to appeal to a mind greater than our own. Lastly, humans have a deontic purpose, and by deontic, I'm referring to duty. So it's morality, but it's more than just morality, it's a moral duty. And duty is owed to persons. A mind is personal. Therefore, a mind is responsible for human purposes. Now, that is a huge argument that requires a lot of fleshing out. I'll stop sharing my screen here. That requires a lot of fleshing out, and I'm happy to develop that more in our Q&A and even afterwards. But that begins with our quick 20 minutes here to just quickly give you an idea of what I'm talking about as an argument from machines to God as we start to look at the universe from not just the parts it's made of, but the purposeful whole that things are made for. And what does that teach us not only about ourselves, but about God. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you so much, Andy, for that talk and giving us that overview of this topic of machines and the argument for God from machines. I'm sure everyone has a lot to think about and process, and we're really looking forward to all of your questions. So just before we transition to the Q&A time, we have a follow-up form for you to fill out. And this just allows us to get some feedback on how the talk went, and you can indicate if you're interested in talking about some of these topics further. So you'll see on the chat, there's a link to that follow-up form. So you can click on that now. And in that form, there are questions about how you enjoyed the talk and which specific talk you came to. And then also you can indicate on there if there's other topics that you'd be interested in talking more about, and if there's any of the follow-up activities that we have coming up that you'd like to be involved in. So I encourage you to take a moment to fill that out because we'd really love to hear from you. And yeah, so we'll transition over to our Q&A time. We just want to remind you that we're going to be using Slido for questions. So you can go to slido.com and the code is relevant 2022. So make sure you add that 2022, relevant 2022 is the code. And we will start with our questions. So just gonna look over here. So we have our first question here. I'll read it out. So wouldn't defining humans as machines result in the strongest form of determinism, since machines are not self-directed, but entirely pre-programmed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that obviously is a risk, that when you want to start looking at a human being as a machine, which interestingly enough, by the way, is what ultimately resulted in determinism. When you look back at the Enlightenment, and particularly when you read Descartes, Descartes was very curious how the human body worked, and in fact he refers to the body as a machine, but he makes this distinction that ultimately gets developed into dualism. But he basically says, well, what if I just kind of take the humanity out of the question? But he talks about mind. What if I take mind out of the equation, and what if we just look at a human as a body? And what could we learn about the body? So we could learn things about the heart and those kind of aspects. Now, Descartes didn't mean for this to become this duality that ends up developing between like brain and mind sort of thing. But that is an aspect of what develops in our society today, where we say, okay, well, how do we look at a human? And we have a culture that right now where everything becomes very reductive, and people are viewed much more as in fact machines, as a brain, and that you are just these chemical reactions and those sorts of things. So yes, you can view a human being like that, but you don't have to view a human being like that. So we could say, well, there's multiple things going on. I have a body, but also I'm more than just a body. And that's where that argument that I was getting at that starts to get interesting, because we would agree that we are more than a body, and that we are more than just deterministic, that we have these that we have this ability to act, we have a will, and that we understand that there is a right way to behave and a wrong way to behave, and that we believe that when we encounter other people, that there are these duties that we owe to these people, to other, what's often referred to in philosophy as I-thou relationships, such that there are ways that we should and shouldn't behave as human beings. And so then we're starting to get outside of that deterministic viewpoint. So again, notice what's happening here. One view wants to see a person as just parts following laws. The other view that I'm proposing is saying that there's a difference between the parts that a thing's made of, but the purpose that a thing is made for. And when you go into that realm, now we're not talking about determinism any longer. Now this is not deterministic.
Okay, thank you. And I wonder, could you just give a brief summary of what would you define determinism as? Like, what does that mean? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. So determinism is basically just saying that the universe is law-like, but more than that, everything is law-like. And in other words, if everything is just simply following laws, then it means that everything becomes deterministic, in that we can, if we had at least enough knowledge of the parts that are in the universe, in the trajectories that they're going, then we could calculate, if you will, where they came from and where they're headed. And so this becomes a very strong form of determinism that was developed, or I should say, was thought of, kind of like dominoes, if you will, that when the universe was created and these parts are flowing into, these parts are set into motion, that everything from there is just a cascade of dominoes falling one after the other. So that's one way of viewing the universe. And of course, I'm arguing that the universe is in fact not that way, that our actions are not determined, and that we have a choice on how we act, and that we're held accountable to how we act.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. So I'll go to the next question. It's, since humans existing and having a purpose points to a creator, does the existence of a creator with a purpose then point to a creator's creator?
That is a really good question. That's one of the things that I have thought about as well. What would that would this argument continue, sort of thing? And I would argue that in fact this argument does not need to continue. That this is one of the reasons why I think, actually, from a Christian perspective, God provides an interesting counter perspective with regards to the nature of who God is. So if God is uncreated, so if God is eternal, then this means that God doesn't, owe his existence to anything else. And then if God is self-sufficient within himself, and this particularly comes out in a Trinitarian, Christian Trinitarian concept of God, that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you get this idea of a relational God living in right relationship within himself. In the Christian philosophy and theology, this is where the concept of love and goodness come from, is that we would say that love and goodness are part of the essence of who God is, that God lives in right relationship within himself, and that in living in right relationship, that God is the very embodiment of morality or goodness. God is the embodiment of relationship. And so we're not then appealing to anything else to account for God. Whereas with regards to human beings, we came into existence. Same thing with the universe, having come into existence. This argument then is applying in that sort of way. Now, I guess that's an interesting question that was brought up, is could we ask then what is the purpose of God? And in that sense, really what we're looking at from a Christian perspective is that we're looking at this concept of morality, or this concept of love, which is the way in Christianity God is often referred to or defined as, that God is love. Not that love is God, but God is loving. And then you see that developing in God's purposes, but not that God was given those things, but that these are things are inherent to God's nature, is the way that I would start to wrestle with that question.
Okay, yeah. So I guess just to clarify, would you say that God does have a purpose or not?
I guess I would say yes and no, but not, it would be a different kind of purpose, and it would be a different kind of existence than we have.
Okay.
That's where I'm trying to be more cautious on that, because we have a created purpose, whereas God has an eternal purpose. And so I'd argue that those are different in kind.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. So we'll go on to our third question. It is, can we characterize nature and natural selection as a mind capable of implementing the purpose of survival? Morality has been tied to survival, think community and reputation.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question, and this is something that people continue to think about, and this is something that people like Polanyi thought a lot about. And for him and for me, and because I think he gives some really compelling arguments with regards to this, particularly as he moved from science into philosophy, and it brought him to Christian theology, or that he dabbled in, at least. And that is his argument and his concern with something like neo-Darwinism is that the operational principle, if you will, is kind of, or let me say it this way, the organizing principle. I'm trying not to use philosophical terms because it gets confusing. But what is it that is creating in that process? And what you ultimately see is that something that is deterministic or random is just two sides of the same coin, and that neither of these are capable of creating things like meaning or purpose, in which something is fulfilling, again, that from to concept of what is it pointing to, what are those parts achieving, sort of idea. And so that becomes problematic within the neo-Darwinian view of things, because that's a law-like function, but purpose is not law-like. Now, and by the way, one of the reasons I was giving an argument with regards to my argument there earlier is we know that it's not law-like because you can't use law to determine purposes. And I could give many, many examples where science cannot, for example, revive a dead language. It doesn't matter how much you study it or how much you reduce it to its parts and figure out the laws. The purposes are not found in those parts nor the laws. And so now we're dealing with something other. So if we're appealing to neo-Darwinism that is just appealing to either determined or random acts, those don't have the requisite control to account for purposes. Now, if you don't like the idea of humans having purposes, the very fact that humans can give machines purposes is a demonstration that we are doing something over and above natural shaping. And again, this needs to be accounted for. Now, I'll just say one more thing with regards to this that becomes problematic. Evolution, in this sense of neo-Darwinism, is getting the cart before the horse. So I'm not opposed to neo-Darwinism, but I would argue then that the neo-Darwinism would need to have been being used within a bigger worldview than just random or determined functions. If that's your only ordering principle, I'm saying that's not enough. But it could be a part of it. But here's where things get problematic, and you often come back to this idea of an origin of life problem. And that is that you also have to remember that we could view cells as a machine. In fact, quite complicated machines. And my point of bringing that up is that neo-Darwinism requires life for you to get evolved life, but you can't appeal to neo-Darwinism to account for life in the first place. So now again, we're in need of this ordering principle that's able to operate over and above natural shaping or natural laws to account for things like purposes. I know I'm talking fast here, but I hope that that's starting to make sense. And if you have time and want to stick around afterwards, you can, talk with me more about this and push me more on that.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. We'll move on to our fourth question. We need a clear definition of purpose. Purpose, in my opinion, is a completely human-centric concept. Does purpose exist if there is no one to conceptualize it?
Yeah, so some people could make this argument that, and this is one way to try to get out of what I'm talking about, and that is to say that purpose doesn't exist, or that purpose is just this concept kind of idea. The problem is that that's incoherent. And the reason that it's incoherent is right now I am demonstrating the power of purpose. I am using sound waves in very purposeful ways to communicate information through the English language. And this then is being understood, and we are having a conversation. Now, that then would entail that either we're not having a conversation and all of this is just an illusion then, and there are some people that go that route. You could claim, and I know philosophers like Alex Rosenberg and others who would, or even Dawkins at times, leans in that direction, that this is all just an illusion. And you can choose to believe that. But I am quite convinced that this is not an illusion, and that purpose, in fact, does exist, and I can demonstrate it in a multiplicity of ways, from the car I drive to the language I'm speaking right now, to any other number of ways to demonstrate that, which tell me that these are realities that I need to reckon with.
All right, interesting. Well, the next question is, must the mind behind humans be a divine being? Could it not be through an infinite regress of infinite minds? Example, directed panspermia, or perhaps the Matrix?
Yeah, I would agree. You could definitely go that route. You could now Matrix. I would say no, you can't go the Matrix route. And the reason you can't go the Matrix route is because you would be getting the cart before the horse. If you're talking about the movie, at least, the Matrix is machines, right? And machines are created by people. So you can't have machines creating people. Like, people don't owe their existence to machines. Machines owe their existence to people. So I don't think that you could use the Matrix example, but I think you could use like alien life, or if there are people that want to posit this idea that the universe is like this grand mind sort of concept. Yes, you can posit that would be one way of looking at it.
Okay, so I guess what leads you to make the argument that it's a divine mind?
The thing that leads me to make the argument that it's a divine mind is particularly being developed in that second argument that I was bringing forward, is that we have to ask ourselves, what has the requisite control, or another way of saying, what has the ability to give a human being the purpose of moral duties? And we could, develop that more, but it's just interesting when you, for example, when you think about people, and you ask yourself, what is in the hierarchy of how we define people? What is at the top? Well, it's interesting that it's not intelligence or popularity or money or any of those things, because all of them can be overshadowed by one's moral character. So, for example, no one's going to care whether or not Hitler was intelligent, or if he was wealthy or popular or the like. It's his moral character that ultimately becomes the defining factor. And we see this not just in figures like that, but everybody. This ultimately is the way that we see people in this kind of hierarchy of purposes. And that raises profound questions then, about what can account for that. What can account for not just morality, because some people would try to account for morality for like moral facts as a thing. They just say that facts are just a reality that exists in some sort of kind of Platonic way that they've just always been, always will. And we somehow have tapped into the moral facts of the universe. And that's fine. You can hold that idea if you choose. But the problem is moral facts require nothing of you. They don't demand anything of you. Whereas duty is different. Duty is that responsibility that you and I encounter when we come into an I-thou relationship, that it's not just what you should do, but what you ought to do. For example, if I steal from my friend, I have no duty to the moral fact that I stole from him. My duty is actually to him. Duties are owed to persons, not to objects. So my point in bringing that up is whatever is responsible for having created a human being, if our purpose is a moral duty, if it's deontic, then that you're going to need to appeal to something that can account for that. And I think the Christian understanding of God provides the most robust understanding of how to understand morality and duty, where you have both morals and personhood coming together in the person of God, this triune God that embodies morality. That to me then becomes the most coherent way of understanding it.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Our sixth question: if people have purpose, how do we account for people that seem to lack moral intuition or a sense of moral duty? So maybe tied into what you were just talking about.
Yeah. Great question. And, one of the things that I have done a lot as a part of my doctoral work and books that I have written is that very thing. How does that work? Why are there some people that appear to not have, we could use a Hitler-like figure, for example. I know he's the constant lightning rod that we use, but what went wrong there? Like, didn't he have the purpose of morality? And this is where things get very interesting. And that is that people have a duty, and this actually furthers my argument. People have a duty to I-thou relationships, to persons. And what we began to realize in genocide studies, as an example, that genocides are made possible not because people have lost their purpose of moral beings or that they are devaluing people. It's that they are denying another person that I-thou relationship. This is what dehumanization is and does. We have exchanged an I-thou relationship for an I-it relationship. We now are viewing a person as either an object or an animal. And when we do that, we can then treat them as an object or an animal. But if we see them as a person, then we are confronted. And again, that duty engages, and we have responsibilities to that person. I could develop this more, but I make the argument that people do not murder people. People do not murder people. In all my historical studies, I've never seen a counterexample to this. And ultimately, what I'm just simply saying is this, that people, yes, they will murder other people, but how are they doing it? When you look at it, they will always reduce that person to something less than human. And as soon as they do that, then it is quite easy to exterminate on a mass scale. I could say a whole lot more there, but I'll stop there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's making sense. Like the idea that we have our moral duty to other people, I guess, and then so once we dehumanize people, then it kind of gives that room to treat them terribly, and we lose that sense of moral duty.
That's right. So we don't see examples historically of people questioning whether or not humans have value, for example. What you see is people questioning whether or not another person is human. That's what you see. So like, for example, if you went back in time and you were talking to a Nazi, for example, or somebody from the Khmer Rouge from Cambodia, right? And you were saying, hey, don't you think that it's wrong to murder people, right? They would say, well, of course it's wrong to murder people, but that person over there, but they are not a human, they are not a person. And that starts to help you to understand, not that that's an excuse, by the way. That's not an excuse for one's behavior, but it helps you to start to understand the mechanics of how it works.
Right. Yeah. What's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So our seventh question, God is eternal, so he doesn't owe existence and thus doesn't have a creator. This argument applies to the universe too. You are assuming that there is a start.
Right. So up until around 100 years ago, people thought that the Aristotelian view of the universe was correct, that the universe was eternal. And so the Bible, like the Christian view that God created the universe, was like out of step with culture. But and I'm sure this individual knows that we have, with different studies that have happened from people like George Lemaitre and others, we began to see that light from stars in distant galaxies are moving away from us and beginning to realize that the universe is expanding. And if you rewind the tape on that, you see that it would be contracting, and you get this idea of a start of the universe. Now, I know that people will have challenged that idea that the universe had a beginning. This gets into a whole argument that William Lane Craig has popularized, that he calls the Kalam cosmological argument, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, I know that people will try to get out of that and try to get back into an eternal universe so that they can get out of that. I just haven't seen that done successfully yet. Or the only thing that I have seen that people will attempt to do is posit a multiverse to get out of that. And then at that point, you just have to ask yourself, which makes more sense? That there's 5 Spider-Men out there, right? That, or that there's, or there's not. Marvel got it right, yeah. Or that God exists and created the universe that you and I live in.
Right. Yeah.
By the way, though, I think you'd just have to say that you would need to still deal with. It's not like this is a get out of jail free card, philosophically and scientifically. You still would need to understand where the multiverse came from and how that's operating. Ultimately, I find that you just descend into this infinite regress of causes. What caused that caused that caused that? You're right. Going to need to have a starting place.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, our next question. How could someone argue about where minds come from? If they accept that science cannot create a purpose, how do we then prove where that mind came from?
Well, let me just clarify really quick here. I'm not saying that science can't create a purpose. I haven't really thought about whether or not science can create a purpose. I mean, scientists, actually, I would say science can't create a purpose because purposes are the intentions of mind. So scientists can create a purpose, which, by the way, is really interesting. This is one of the things that led Michael Polanyi out of science into philosophy, is he was very concerned by the philosophical ideas that were being embraced in science, because he said he would ultimately argue that science was killing the scientists. If you view everything from that very reductive law-like way, well, you don't have science any longer. Science is this creative endeavor of discovery where you're using your intuition and, in this heuristic effort of creativity to discover the unknown. And you completely unravel that depending upon the worldview you're operating from, particularly if it's a very law-like reductive worldview. Okay, but with that clarified, how do we then prove where that mind can come from? So what I'm ultimately arguing then is that what we see is the activity of mind, and ultimately we need to account for that activity. And there are different philosophers that are not Christian, that are not theists, guys like Chalmers and many others, who agree that mind exists and people appear to be not only conscious, but they have intentions. And we can't just pretend like that doesn't exist, although you could try to just say, oh, it's just an illusion. but others are getting more serious about it and saying, no, this actually does exist. Let's stop pretending like it doesn't. And then you need to account for why that is the case. So then all I'm saying is that given the arguments that I made, it would appear then that there's good reason to believe that we, in fact, are the product of mind.
Right. Yeah. So I guess to clarify, like, would you say that it's something we prove, or is it kind of coming to a logical conclusion?
I would say that we can't prove anything in the idea of 100%, this idea of like 100% proof kind of concept. What we have is we can be 100% confident, but we can't have this unrealistic idea of 100% proof. I would argue personally that it doesn't exist. And the closest that maybe we can even get to it was Descartes' "I think, therefore I am." If there's one thing that I would appear to be absolutely convinced of is that I'm thinking, and to question it would be self-refuting. So, I mean, maybe that's as close as you can get, but like, let me just give you a court of law example of where I'm getting at. You could ask, can we have absolute confidence that Bob murdered Jane, for example? Well, it's like, no, all we can have is good reason to believe, beyond all reasonable doubt is the way our court systems work. And it's not, and the reason that is because that's the best you can get at. I mean, even if Bob confesses to killing Jane, you could say, well, then do we know for certain? Well, no, because I can think of all sorts of reasons why Bob would falsely confess to killing Jane. Maybe it was Bob's son who actually did it. We've all watched CSI and whatnot, right? We've all seen, various examples of why somebody would do that. And so again, I'm just saying we need to be more realistic about how this actually works, how faith and beliefs work, that we study things, we see evidence, and we draw a conclusion of what we think is reasonable, what we have good reason to believe is the way things are, what's truth.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Which, by the way, isn't simply the domain of religion. That's the domain of science as well. It happens in both. Both operate on faith.
Right. Yeah. So we'll go through a couple more questions here. So the next one is, explain how purpose implies creator. A rule to be used for extrapolation cannot be defined by examples, i.e., humans' perception of things with purpose.
Okay, so first of all, I would argue that an act of creation is synonymous with purpose, that they're the same, that an act of creation is an act of purpose, and an act of purpose is an act of creation. That when you're taking the parts, when you're taking particulars, if you will, again, when you're taking the parts of the universe and you are putting them together in purposeful wholes, you are creating purpose. That purpose is the creation. Again, that those two are in tandem. I'm not separating those two things. So like, for example, in Genesis 1 verse 1, when the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, I'm saying that's an act of purpose. That's an act of intention.
Okay.
So again, I'm not saying that this is a perception. I would say that this is a difference between a part versus a composite whole. And I don't think that a composite is a perception. I think we see composites all around us, and that now, again, intuitively, we distinguish between the parts and the purposeful whole that a thing's made for. And we make a ontological distinction between those two. We see them as separate things. And I'd argue because they are, in fact, separate things. And again, you could make the same argument with language. Language is not a perception.
Right. Okay, we'll go on to the 10th question. You have talked about humans having a purpose. Can you go into more detail about what you think that purpose is and how we live it out?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. This is also something that I've given a lot of thought to. So purpose can be looked at both statically and dynamically. And I would say that dynamic purpose has its limits at some level, that we can see that by watching people in operation, that they appear to have intention, that they appear to have morality, and they appear to have responsibility or duties to other persons. And so I think that we could deduce at one level that humans are relational creatures, and that we have this relational purpose, and that we operate best in relationship with each other. And I think if anything that this pandemic has hopefully shown you and I is just how profound that need for relationship in each one of us goes. Now, the thing where Christianity provides an interesting development on this is Christianity argues, though, that our need for relationship is deeper than any person can fulfill completely. So yes, we need each other, but our need for relationship is deeper. And so the Christian understanding of human purpose, and we see this, talks about in the Bible, and particularly Jesus picks this up and develops this, or talks about it repeatedly from a Jewish perspective, is he's asked often, what's the greatest commandment? Or that's a way of asking a Jew, what's the greatest or most important thing to know about life? What's the purpose of all this? And his answer consistently is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Notice that's a Hebraic way of saying love God with everything that it means to be human, heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, you are created for a relational purpose, but it's more than just loving people. It's loving God, that you were created to be in a relationship with God, in a relationship with people. And so I would say that begins to round out what we see, even when you think about it from that dynamic purpose perspective, that relationship with God is actually informing us morally in that concept of deontic duty of how I ought to love other people. So we need both of those. We need that relationship with God, and we need that relationship with people as it gets developed relationally. So that's the argument that I would give to that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So this will probably be our last question. Does this argument argue that things can only be made by more complex things?
That's an interesting question. I'd have to think about that one. There's a part of me that wants to actually say no in some regards, and I know that might sound odd, but this is, I think, something that's unique about God, is I would actually say that God is inherently simple, whereas we are a composite. I don't necessarily think that God is a composite like we are. I think that God isn't some like grand machine, in other words. It doesn't have all the structure that necessarily you and I have, where this is kind of unique, where, to try to quickly give you some ideas to get you to think about this, we make a distinction between a brain and a mind. So we would say, for example, that you're on my mind, but I wouldn't say that you're on my brain, because we make this distinction between these two, so that we could say that you could have half a brain, but we wouldn't say that you could have half a mind. A mind is more simple in that regard, in that it doesn't come in degrees, in other words. And I think that this is more apt. So when we're talking about God, that God is simple in that kind of conceptual way. God doesn't come in degrees like, say, a body could come in degrees. Whereas persons, again, you can't have half a person. If you were to cut off my arm and my leg, you don't have half of Andy. You still have all of Andy, but you might have half of a body. So that's where I'd be really hesitant to kind of go down that route to say by more complex things, because I don't think that's necessarily the case about God.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So that is actually all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much, Andy, for your talk and for sharing all of your insights and answers to those great questions. If you didn't get your question answered, don't worry. We have a follow-up Zoom call happening right after this. So if you still have questions that you want to talk about, you can join that Zoom call. And Andy will be sticking around, and there'll be some others on that call as well. And we can have a further discussion. And yeah, so the link is in the chat, I believe. Yes. So now I have a couple of announcements. One is Alpha. So Alpha is going to be a follow-up event that we have starting next week. And Alpha is an interactive series which engages people in conversations about the Christian faith. And it's a series of sessions focused on questions of life, faith, and meaning. And each session includes time to connect, watch a talk on video, and share any thoughts or questions that you have. So please join us. We'll begin to meet online on January 25th. And if you're interested or would like to receive more information about Alpha, you can indicate that on your follow-up form. So now we're going to watch a brief video about Alpha. All right. So just wanted to remind you about the feedback form. So the link is in the chat, and you can go there and fill it out if you want to know more about Alpha. It'll help you to give us some feedback on how this talk went, and also indicate if you're interested in other activities we have coming up. And I just have a couple of announcements on the screen. You can take a screenshot so that you can keep all of the announcements handy. But I wanted to let you know that we have 3 more talks coming up this week. So tomorrow there's a talk at 7 p.m. And it's titled Art and Faith Conversation, Suffering and Hope. Does God Care About My Pain? And then on Friday, we have a lunchtime talk at 12, which is titled Longing for Love. And then an evening talk at 7 p.m. Titled Why Would God Care About Who I Sleep With? So yeah, some very interesting topics coming up. So please do join us for these talks. And then we also have Solarium, which is going to be happening tomorrow on Instagram Live on the @RelevantUofT Instagram page. So please check that out at 5 p.m. tomorrow. And then right now we have a post-talk Zoom call. So this will be more of like a casual Zoom call and just an opportunity to continue the conversation. So the link to that talk is on your screen right now, and it is also in the chat. So please join us to continue the conversation. So yeah, I just want to say thank you again to Andy for being here tonight and for sharing with us on this topic. And I know I have a lot to think about. I hope everyone who's attended today has a lot to think about and will reflect and think about how this might apply to your personal life and how what was shared today maybe challenges some of the ideas that you had coming into this talk. We thank you again for your time, and we hope to see you at some of our future events. Take care.